Welcome to Build. I'm your host, Ricky Camilleri. In 1981, an Indian guru and his cult moved to an estate in Oregon with the intention of shaping a community around their beliefs. Wild Wild Country, directed by our guest Maclain and Chapman and produced by Mark Duplass, doesn't just tell the story of a fascinating cult's existence in a rural community in America, but it explores all the gray areas of what constitutes a religion and what protections are afforded to those that are not and are defined as a religion. Let's take a look.
Everybody felt they were there at the beginning of the great experiment, like we were the chosen people.
I'm here in one of the largest ranches in the Northwest. Today, it's Rajneeshpuram because a prominent Indian guru and his followers bought it.
Our vision was to create a community
Based on compassion and sharing.
Bhagwan's agenda was simply to raise the consciousness of humanity. That was his goal.
America was land of promise. It was my conviction we will have no problems.
I don't think America has a place for these people.
Everyone in Antelope mistrusts Rajneesh.
I want that guru and his evil influence out of my city.
They're run by satanic power.
There is talk of vigilantes who may seek revenge on the Rajneeshis.
A bomb went off in the middle of the community.
More than 60 followers evacuated.
It was a catastrophe.
Mostly unjust, terrified. If I didn't take measures to protect our community, no one else would do it.
We call upon the governor to disarm this cult's army now.
If the government does decide to get you, they're going to get you.
Who would poison a whole town?
The Rajneeshis set a stage for a big outbreak to influence the election.
They had no evidence.
They were facing immigration fraud, smuggling.
The Rajneeshis came this close to murdering a presidential appointee.
There is bias, there is prejudgment, religious discrimination, and this is democracy. I've had enough of it.
We were going to mount a full-scale assault.
We will be ready to protect ourselves.
I'd grown up understanding thou shalt not kill. What had happened?
There's darkness in all of us. Doesn't make you a bad person.
Guys, thanks for being here. Congrats on the series. It's amazing. I can't wait to finish it. Talk to me about how it started, though. You were working on this other documentary, and then you stumbled across these tapes.
Yeah, we did a feature documentary back in 2014 called The Battered Bastards of Baseball, and that was on a baseball team that played in Portland, Oregon during the 1970s. And basically, when you walk into film archives in the Pacific Northwest, you'll see a lot of tapes that say like Bhagwan or Rajneeshpuram on the tapes. And this wasn't a story that I had any idea about. We grew up in kind of the Los Angeles area. And basically, we kind of popped a tape in, and we saw like almost 5,000 people in red building kind of this utopian city in the desert, and immediately just visually as documentary filmmakers, we were like, wow, all right, well, what's this story about? And so as we kind of started diving in, we started reaching out to characters, kind of like our cast almost, and pretty quickly we got back from them like this was kind of the most important thing that had ever happened to them in their entire life. It was very significant to them. And so as documentary filmmakers, we were just like, this story is really big and incredible. We would love to tell it in the episodic format, and hooked up with Mark, and we kind of teamed up on it and kind of brought it to Netflix and made it.
We didn't hook up. We just like, we talked,
Not talking about it.
then we hooked up later. So, yeah.
Once you saw how good it was, you're like, oh, I'll give you
I
the
was like,
goods.
all right, let's hook up.
I'll show
Well, I
you
mean,
what
there's a
they
lot of
got.
free love in the documentary. We got in the spirit. It's,
What was the pitch like for you? I mean, did they show you some of the footage, or had you heard of this group?
yeah, I mean, I knew the guys because I really loved Battered Bastards of Baseball. That's on Netflix now, and you should see it. It's an incredibly well done doc. So I was a fan first. And then a friend of ours named Josh Braun, who's a great film sales agent. He puts together tough to get made projects like this, you know. He had been representing this, and he basically brought it to me and said, look, I know you're a documentary fan, but you haven't really made a lot of documentaries. Would you by chance won a partner on us, and he was like, the story about how in the early 80s in Oregon, this religious movement came in and they went to war with a small town, and remember, it was the largest case of food poisoning, largest case of wiretapping. I was like, I haven't heard of this story at all. And I started talking to people about it, and no one had heard about it. We've heard of Jonestown, and that was incendiary enough. And then we sort of heard like the Koresh versions, and this hadn't been told.
There's really no, I mean, it's odd because this is right in between Jonestown and Waco, and you don't really have anything like this, I mean, in terms of the popular history. Like, you don't hear about
and
this.
that really struck me. I mean, like, as we all know, we all have 400 movies and 400 television shows on our Netflix queue right now. So I'm always thinking, why do we need to make this? Do we need to make this? And when I saw that, no one had seen this story, and then once you really dig into the story and you see, to me, the core of the story is about that fear of the other, is this small conservative town watching this religious force come in their way of life and being afraid of them and digging their heels in because they don't understand them. Likewise, the Rajneeshis being sort of fearful of these sort of small town conservative people who were reluctant to them and profiling them. And I was like, well, this is as relevant in 2018 as anything I've seen. So that sealed it for me.
And there are phrases that are uttered that are, I think I heard last year during the election from some of the people, the conservatives who lived in the town.
I'm going to grab her, but was that?
That was the one, yeah.
No,
So
just check, yeah.
The Rajneeshi, actually, I think said. No, stuff that was kind of like, they didn't like our way of life. They thought they could teach us. They thought that they knew better than us, that we were stupid. And I was like, oh, I remember hearing all that stuff about a year and a half ago. Except it was just Democrats saying that, not an Indian cult that was due to poison people. The footage of the film of the series is really phenomenal. Was that on a lot of the tapes that you found? Just like
it
free
was.
Love, naked
yeah,
people
we got
dancing?
really lucky. So the story starts in 1981, and back then the format that they filmed on were called U-matic tapes, and they were kind of came out right before Betacam, and so. Back in those days, the nightly local news would film over whatever they filmed the previous day, but these news stations knew that this was such a bizarre, significant story that was unfolding that they decided not to tape over the kind of daily news footage. So we ended up with over 300 hours of archive footage that all these local affiliates were kind of filming inside the ranch at the time, which is really rare because a lot of these big cult stories, you don't really get to inside the commune. And so I think that's what kind of makes this special is you get to really get a really intimate view of what was
you
going
kind of get to let them tell the story. I mean, these guys interviewed, everyone who was in the Rajneeshi cult and a lot of the members of the town of Antelope and let them tell the story that they went through directly. Plus, you get to watch the footage of them doing it. I mean, if you go back and watch sort of, the major cult, for whatever, lack of a better word, documentaries like the Jonestown doc and the big Waco doc, it's mostly people talking about their opinions about what it is who don't have that firsthand knowledge, and this is all from everyone who went through it, which I thought was really unique.
Yeah, totally. I think this is I think what we were initially really getting attracted to as we kind of started to make this series was both sides claim that they're heroes and both sides say the other side is pure evil. But for each of these sides in this documentary, they see it as clearly black and white and right and wrong. And so I think it's interesting I hope it's interesting for the viewers to as they work their way through this series to make draw their own lines on who might have been right and who might have been wrong. You'll hear Rajneeshi say we just wanted to build this utopian paradise and we bought 64,000 acres in the middle of nowhere in the Oregon desert and we just wanted to be left alone. And you'll kind of hear the Antelopians say well, we were a town of 40 people and we just wanted to be left alone too. But kind of as you work your way through, you see these two groups. They never really make compromises. They just each kind of go farther and farther away from each other until it becomes just a full-on war in the state of Oregon.
It does feel like there's a sense of hindsight, though, with the people that you're interviewing, because they all kind of talk about it as much as it's black and white for them. It feels like they've reflected on it a little bit. There's I felt like I was wrong, or we felt like they were doing this, and both sides kind of say that, which at the very least sounds on the surface of it like there's a bit of regret that they could have gone about it differently. Did you get a sense of that at all?
Absolutely. I think looking back 40 years later, it's always a little bit easier in hindsight to say, hey, maybe we could have done this differently a little bit.
It was a little too aggressive.
Yeah, but I think still to their core, I think that this religious community feels that there was a lot of prejudice and bigotry, and they got pushed up back up against the wall and then lashed out. And I think this conservative town feels like, hey, we were invaded by a cult that was the largest case of biochemical terrorism in the history of the United States, and we're the victims. And so, interestingly enough, both sides claim that they were the victimized group. And so, hopefully, as the audience, like Max said, as they watch, they kind of figure out where they fall.
Yeah, it's kind of like we wanted to capture the intentions and ambitions up front, but kind of as you work your way through, it's like a plot develops to bus in 5,000 homeless people from across the country. They send Greyhound buses to all the cities to bring in homeless people, try and bolster up their numbers before the 1984 November elections. When that plan doesn't kind of work out, I mean, they were successful in busing in homeless people. It was also a two-part plan. They put salmonella in like 10 different restaurants across the Dalles, and 750 people got sick with salmonella poisoning. So it's like when push came to shove, the Rajneeshis could like definitely shove. Like they weren't afraid of that, and ultimately like they armed themselves with semi-automatic weapons and kind of became pretty militant towards the end. So it's an interesting story because like this is coming after Jonestown, and like cult hysteria was really big in the early 80s in America. It's a particular time in our history. And the Rajneeshis just felt like, well, that wasn't our intentions, that wasn't our ambitions. We wanted to show what we could do, and we were pushed down this path.
I think it's a really good point. Like the Jonestown massacre was like 1978. This is all happening a few years later. And even though media back then wasn't what it is now, those images from Jonestown, those slaughtered bodies all out in the field, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of a small town Oregon rancher and you see another thing that looks like a cult coming in, you're just going to be afraid of it, just as like, the media today has put images of terrorism towards us and made us afraid of certain images. That's what they were inundated with, and I look at this story and I don't know if they feel regret, but I feel like really sad that like these were some of the greatest minds of a generation. These were like Harvard graduates in city planning and engineering who came together, brought all their resources, and built a city out of scratch. And it's incredible. They were leaders in green technology, and they were doing things that I look at, I'm like, man, if they had come like 5 years earlier before that Jonestown situation or clear of that, like they might have done something really kind of great. And it's a bummer.
You say that the cult hysteria, it's funny, I remember being a kid in the 80s and finding books in the library that were like, what if your kid is in a cult? And so you don't see that anymore, but there was like a true hysteria around cults and Satanism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well. We kind of covered that in our series. It was kind of a way for the Christian right to take the word cult and weaponize it to delegitimize and demean this group that was kind of moving in. And so we kind of get into that of what is the difference between religion and cult. How the term cult can be weaponized to take down groups.
Yeah, one of the kind of like interesting things that we really found is kind of like this becomes one of the biggest like church-state issues of 1980s America, which was basically this group had come in that was in a lot of ways an entity that was a church. They owned exclusively a city. It was an incorporated city, and so the church came like, is there too much intermingling here? Are they violating the separation of church and state? And this was a case that was going to go straight to the Supreme Court. It got settled by the Oregon Supreme Court. Eventually, they did say this. Yes, this was a violation of the constitutional separation of church and state. But I think that as you hear both sides, you'll hear Rajneeshis be like, well, look at the state of Utah, or look at Boston and Catholics in the 1960s, or look at other groups. They only made this an issue because they didn't like what we were doing in this part of the state. And I think ultimately there's really no easy answers with that on what the difference between cult and religion is, and it takes some critical thinking, and hopefully I think that like that's hopefully why I'm so excited that we were able to make this as a series, because you're able to kind of deeply dive into that without providing like right or wrong answers.
I think ultimately the culprit was the sheer number of Rolls-Royces that Bhagwan, the cult leader, had. I think if he had kept it to like 5 or 6.
93 was
93 was a lot. Yeah.
I think one of my favorite moments of the series is when his assistant is on a talk show and a woman is criticizing him for having 17 Rolls-Royces, and she goes, "It's 20 now." And just like everyone, no one knows, she owns everybody because no one knows how to deal with that sort of flagrant egotism. Can you talk about her, because you have an amazing series here, and even if you didn't have her, you would have an incredible story to tell. But getting her to be interviewed for it is like a huge accomplishment and makes the series something completely else.
Absolutely, yeah. So Manan Sheila was the guru's personal secretary, which really means she ran the entire business, the entire worldwide empire. At their height, they had around 200, 300,000 followers around the world. So this was actually a huge religious movement that was taking hold all over certain parts of Europe, Australia.
Japan, right?
Japan had some communes. And Sheila was kind of responsible for running the entire show. When they came to America, the guru steps back, takes a vow of silence, and pushes Sheila forward to be the face of this movement. I think she was 28 years old when she first came here. She was young, and she's just very feisty. She has a ferocious wit. She's very strong-willed. She doesn't take no for an answer. And she's just an incredibly strong female character in this story. And it's really fascinating to see how this story unfolds from her point of view.
Yeah, there's something interesting with this called, like, we didn't really think about this that much. We started making this 4 years ago. But like all of the leaders within the Rajneeshis and under Bhagwan were women, and he really believed in like these people who are intelligent, who are also in touch with their emotions, in touch with the energy fields, and so he would basically employ and promote these young, strong women to run things, and it was really like it's kind of eye-opening to us as we watch what's happened in the last couple of years and realize like, oh wow, we kind of he seemed to get something earlier than a lot of people did. I think it was interesting.
You said you started working on this 4 years ago, right? So I would ask last 2016 during the campaign when all this rhetoric is coming out from I hate to use the phrase both sides because somehow he ruined that phrase for us too. But from the left and the right, did you start to notice parallels then, or were you kind of?
Yeah, it was really strange. So obviously when we started this, Obama
did you
was
like
president.
lean into those parallels?
Yeah, I think. Actually, no. I think, honestly, so a lot of people who have been reviewing it and talking about it have been praising us for showing both sides. And I always say that wasn't from a morally righteous position that we did that, or because we think documentaries. It truly was what we felt cinematically. This story is about two sides. It's not we're making an issue doc and now we want to show the counter argument. This is a story about two groups who refuse to compromise. And so of course, you have your own opinions, your own beliefs, but we really wanted to drop the audience in with these characters, and you're going to hear from them what happened. And if you think they're spinning, maybe they might be spinning some narrative here. If you believe they're reliable, maybe they're reliable. Maybe you think Sheila's lying. And that's kind of part of the entertainment of watching this series is we're not giving you easy answers or easy conclusions.
I think that what was interesting is we flew to Europe to interview Sheila the day after Trump won, which was, didn't plan it, that was just how our production schedule.
I didn't think you were coming back. I was like, okay, here we go.
Yeah.
We're gonna edit here. We're good.
Yeah. We like
Upload.
it here. Yeah. But I think that election impacted our interviewees more than it interviewed, because I think that suddenly people felt like they had something that they wanted to say on camera. And I think that it was really interesting. I didn't know what that would do to our documentary series. Obviously, there was a lot more important things to be thinking about than just the series that we were working on. But
can I ask, did you talk to her about it? Did she talk about that at all?
Yeah, well, it was weirdly, I mean, the first
we were kind of terrified because so Manan Sheila was convicted of the largest case of biochemical terrorism in United States history. So we flew there the day after Trump's election.
Had lunch, set up for lunch. Yeah.
We were getting out of the car and I saw her approaching, and of course they were a little bit nervous, and the first thing out of her mouth was she immediately started roasting us for the Trump presidency and for how America had lost all of its sense of culture and politics and what was going on over there. We were ruining everything, and she was very charming and very funny, and it was her first words out of her mouth was making fun of us.
Yeah.
And you said I brought my own lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. So 4 years ago, you started working on this. What has the process been over the course of 4 years? Shooting it and editing it? Do you get all of your footage together and then start cutting, or are you writing and cutting at the same time?
So the first thing that we did was there's probably over 50 books that have been written about this topic and about the guru. So the first thing was let's just dive in, read as much as we can. Second part was kind of logging all the footage. We had 300 hours of archive footage that tells the story from beginning to end. Which was an incredible source. And then the third thing was really getting to know the characters. Both people on both sides were very reluctant to sit down and kind of rehash this story again. I think the people in Antelope were very nervous about being stereotyped as one-dimensional conservatives, and I think that this religious group was very nervous about, oh, we're just going to be redefined as this terrorist cult again, and how can we trust you? And so,
have either of these people seen any of it yet?
The only one we know confirmed is that we sent the series to Sheila, and she wrote back a short message that she enjoyed it. So
it'll be interesting to see what their response is. I mean, I think that they are huge participants in the storytelling of this. They weren't really our audience in mind, to be honest. This was a story that I think a lot of people are coming to for the first time that just have no idea about it. So we were always kept that kind of audience in mind because that's how we came to it. We didn't know about it. So people who are heavily involved in the story know a lot more and are a lot more opinionated on the matter than people who are just coming into as beginners, kind of. And so I think
as Netflix bingers.
Exactly.
Did you notice the quote that Netflix, they're so good, they use it in the trailer. It says, like, it's going to make you want to binge. They're like, where's a press script with the word binge in it?
Mark, so this isn't your first documentary that you've produced, right?
No, it's not. We did, we've done a couple things. We did Asperger's or Us, which is a documentary about a sketch comedy troupe comprised of members with Asperger's, which is also on Netflix. Thank you, Netflix. Let's just do that all the time because they buy all our stuff.
You're going to want to binge it.
You're going to want to binge that one. Yeah.
One movie.
Yeah. And, but nothing like this as an undertaking. And really my background as a documentarian is just that I'm a huge fan. That's pretty much all that I watch, and it's really informed who I am as a narrative filmmaker, and I'm always trying to find ways to underserve stories and do things that are sort of with a light touch and naturalistic the way documentaries are. But quite frankly, I've just been like terrified to go make a documentary because you normally spend like 7 years of your life doing it and you'll probably lose money. That's just what it is. But this was such a great chance for me to collaborate with the guys, and plus it was this weird kismet thing that Josh Braun, who I mentioned before, who brought us together, he and his twin brother Dan have been selling my movies for years. And these guys are brothers who are going to make the documentary, and they brought it to me and my brother Jay to executive produce, and it was like this little brothers tribe thing. And I mean, this kind of sounds a little bit corny, but like also, you know, these guys are like 10, 15 years younger than me, and like when they came into my office, I was like, this is me and Jay when we had our first movie at Sundance. And it just like, I just wanted to be around that energy.
Yeah, it's been unreal working with the Duplasses and Mark's production company, and like, it's not just like an executive producer. He was someone that like, because one of the biggest hurdles that we faced in the development of this was we had done one feature documentary before, and now we kind of wanted to do like a 6.5+ hour thing because we really, really believe.
Yeah, this should have been like your fourth project. It was kind of a quantum leap.
And I think that there was some obvious like hesitancy to be like, all right, yeah, maybe we like it, but we like it more as a feature, you know. And it really wasn't until we got Mark on board and was really able to like use his full support and backing that this thing happened like that. I mean, it was crazy. It just like all of a sudden we had the opportunity to do this for Netflix and to do it in like 6.5 hour ways. I mean, I think like we're huge fans of the Duplass brothers and always have been. I mean, a weird thing too is like back in the day when Netflix could only stream like 10 movies, the Puffy Chair was one of them. Yeah.
First acquisition, right?
It was one of the early acquisitions, and we were one of the first movies to stream on the site when it was still like looked like a pixelated Atari game, you know.
I will say though, what always set you guys apart right from the beginning from a lot of the low budget filmmakers at the time was your focus on story beats and moving. I wouldn't necessarily say moving quickly, but moving a story along and getting characters to different circumstances or conflicts. And I wonder if that helped you, if you think the same way when you're in an edit room on a documentary like this.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we are big believers in story, and we like telling very traditional stories in very shaggy, underhanded ways. Is kind of how we like to do things. And when you come aboard to produce a project like this with guys who I was a fan of but didn't really know that well, you never really know what you're getting into. They might come in and, you know, pitch really well and be really, really smart, but they just lucked into their last movie being good, and they suck. And then you have to govern them the whole way through. Or sometimes they come in and things are in pretty good shape. And I remember we had a lot of discussions up front about how we're gonna frame this right, how to get the right interviews, how should they be shot, and then when the first cut came in, I was, as always, you're just terrified to watch it. Like the first cut of episode 1 came in, and I watched it, and I remember finishing it, and I was just like, I have like 3 notes, and I'm not sure they're gonna make it any better. And I just knew, like, and it was a perfect scenario where I could use whatever resources I had to help them out. And quite honestly, a lot of that was just like being the Sheila for them and getting them through the door. Yeah. And it was that great example of just like give them the opportunity. And I mean, I kid you not, we edited for what, 1.5 years maybe? And they edited in our home office. They basically moved in with us and became family members. And my kids are like 10 and 6 right now, and they're in that phase where they like to come to the office with me on the weekends to like eat all the candy, basically. And every time I showed up on the weekends, one of them was there working. I mean, they worked non-stop, you know, small team, and really built it themselves.
Mark was like, when is this going to be over?
Yeah, it's like,
when are you going to finish?
And my daughter's like, why are those dudes who smell weird always in the office? And I was like, well, this is...
They live here.
It's a work...
Mark had no more
ethic, honey.
He had no more notes. He's like, it's done. It's fine.
Get out!
It's ready for release.
It's good.
We're only up to episode 4. I don't give a shit. Get out of here.
You're done.
Let's get some questions from the audience. Who do we got? Right here.
Hi. So when you were interviewing the former cult members, did they still follow some of the practices from the cult, and did they keep in touch with each other after all this time?
Yeah, we have, I think, 4 main talking head interviews that were members of the group. And I won't tell you which ones, but as this series kind of unfolds, you kind of start to see them splinter off. And so one of them considers herself an ex-follower and believes that she was a member of a cult. One of our main characters is still very much involved with the movement in Pune, India, even today. And then Sheila, who's kind of our main character, breaks away from the community, but still shares a very deep devotion to the guru, even though he's passed away. She's got portraits and photos of him in her house, still does his daily teachings and meditations, and still very much considers herself a disciple of the guru, but not a member of the religious movement.
And the movement continues today. I mean, the ashram in Pune is still up and running. You can go there. It's maybe a little more like massage and new age relaxation oriented, and you know, Bhagwan changed his name to Osho, and that's like a more well-known, I guess, nomenclature of him, like throughout Europe and stuff like that. So it's still around.
Yeah, it was really interesting. After Rajneesh Puram, Bhagwan Rajneesh was this man's name. Yeah, and he changed his name to Osho. And I feel like internationally, like, because in America, I think it's odd that his most controversial years were here, from 81 to 85 in Oregon. I mean, they really just kind of rocked the entire state for those 4 or 5 years. But as you travel like abroad and you tell people like, oh, I'm working on this thing, and they're like, oh, what's it about? It's like, oh, it's about Osho, and like their eyes light up because they know Osho so well. Like he's like assigned reading like philosophy classes for like high school students that I've like talked to, and they had no idea that he had this American chapter in Oregon. They just kind of thought he was always just like this top Indian guru, one of like the top Indian gurus of the 20th century. So I'm really excited to see how it plays for people who grew up either reading Osho or knew about him, but then find out this kind of like backstory of the movement.
Well, luckily you're on Netflix and it's in 160 countries, right?
That's one of the main reasons we really wanted to do it with them and why they wanted to do it. And I think there's something really special about this story in particular for the binge format and the international binge format, you know, because quite frankly, like, if you are watching this right now and thinking about this, one of your instincts is going to be to go to Wikipedia and find out the story, and I would just say, don't do it. Like, sit down and take 6 hours and roll through it, because you probably don't know a lot about the story, and that's a good thing.
You just got signed another deal with Netflix, right? Aren't you?
Yeah,
Gonna
we you know, they've been so great to us through the years, and we're gonna do 4 more original movies with those guys, and you know.
Are you guys gonna direct? Are you and your brother gonna direct again, or is it gonna be producing?
What we basically do is, you know, we'll write a couple of them and star in a couple of them, and Jay and I lately have kind of, it's pretty interesting. We've kind of moved a little bit away from directing because we've noticed like I can make more stuff and be a part of more things like this if we're not spending that dedicated year and a half only doing one thing, directing a movie. We can spread ourselves around and make more creative partnerships. And I don't know. I mean, that's not to say we won't come back to it soon, but right now it's like really fun just partnering up with different people and making lots of stuff.
Next question.
Hi. So since you were discussing about the binge format, most particularly for this show, what shows off Netflix have you been binging that caught your time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think recently there's 2 documentary series, since we're documentary filmmakers, that we binged. One was Wormwood, the Errol Morris documentary series, which was really fascinating. And then we recently just binge-watched Flint Town, about the Flint Police Department and water crisis on Netflix, and I recommend both of them. I thought they were both really fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that I'm not just saying this because I work with Netflix, but I think that they have always had really great documentaries, not just the originals, but they've always just had a great way of just getting cool docs on their service. And I think that I've always had this weird theory that I think docs play really well on the small screen, like on Netflix, like late at night, just you and the doc, and it's kind of because they're like personal, kind of like intimate things. And so I think that like, yeah, those 2 shows I thought were really great. In terms of this show being bingey, I think that why people are saying that a lot is because we didn't really do it like it's episodic, but it is just like we kind of just tell it chronologically. It's almost like just a 6.5-hour documentary, which I can tell you guys are so excited. A 6.5-hour documentary, it sounds amazing. But yeah, I think that's kind of the way we structured it, was kind of just like planting you in Antelope, Oregon in 1981 when this group arrives. Nothing's happened in Antelope for the last 100 years. It's been the same, and then it's like a bomb goes off in that community, and it's like you're kind of off to the races after that.
I mean, you know, it's interesting to think about watching this in one sitting, because we did an experiment where we showed all 6 episodes in a row at Sundance, and we were super nervous because we were just like, oh, are people going to get squiggly? What does this mean? And like nobody moved, and I do think this thing can work straight through, and I think it's probably the best way to experience if you can find a time for it.
What about the title, Wild Wild Country? Where did that come from, and why?
Yeah, it was a Bill Callahan is a musician, and
Callahan's music in the film a little bit.
He's in he got a couple songs in it, and he has a song called Drover. And the main chorus is, one thing about this wild, wild country is it takes a strong mind, but it breaks a strong mind. And kind of as soon as we heard those lyrics,
we cry when we hear that all the time. It was in the teaser, and I was like, I'm doing it. It's so good.
It just felt so applicable to both Sheila and this guru, who were both kind of had these brilliant minds to come here and kind of see what happened in America to them. And so we kind of, like, I heard that song early on, and it was just kind of like, that's the name.
It's at the core of it for me. Like, the basis of this thing, I think, is like, okay, yes, this is a true crime story. There is this cult aspect, and that is like a clicky thing, you know. But the core and the heart of this that I connected to early on is when you hear these Rajneeshis talk, you hear them talk about being entrenched in a life that was good, but wasn't everything they thought it was going to be. And they felt like they were missing something. And they wanted to do something great and be a part of something revolutionary. And so they decided to create their own community, their own way. Bought a plot of land that was not farmable, that was just not ready for building. And just with their own wit and ingenuity and sweat, worked 16 hours a day and built their ideal city. And that little idealist in me that has that, like, you know, my life is great, but everybody has that malaise in them. Like, what if I had done something amazing? And that's really like the connection point. They like really took a swing for it.
Do you not feel like you've done something amazing, Mark?
No, I don't.
Like, you have like 50
I don't
credits
know how to
on your
use a
IMDb.
hammer. I see them building stuff, and I'm like, man, pretty cool.
I think I have time for one more question.
Hi. Since you guys interviewed like people from different sides and they have different views now, do you think if they sat together and really hashed out and talked about like what happened,
cage match,
do you think they would come to forgive each other?
We had one of our interviews who was a member of the commune who said that she would like to apologize to the members of Antelope for what kind of happened. Other than that, I still think that there are two sides that are deeply entrenched in their viewpoints. And like Max said earlier, I think that both sides think that they were the heroes of the story. I think a lot of Oregonians and locals feel like we kicked them out of the country, we won. And then I think a lot of Rajneeshis and people like Sheila have very deep convictions and ideologies and believe that they were on the right side of history and that they were treated wrongly. So to answer your question, I don't think it would go too well if they sat down. I think.
It might work, and it'll be interesting to hear their reactions to this, because I think that, like we've been talking about, we really tried to not just show both sides because we wanted to, but we found that fascinating. You know, we scored the music to each section to really give full weight and power to the points that each side was making. But I think that it's almost like there was this almost weird opportunity where they might have been able to get along like earlier in the story, maybe. But that cultural divide was just, they weren't really, it just wasn't about like building bridges between these two communities, and they just kind of go farther and farther away from each other. And that's kind of where they are today, I'd say.
And I would say that one thing I found kind of interesting was actually the similarities between the two groups. Antelope was a frontier town that was built by settlers. They built their own village of what they wanted. I would say it's 99% Christians that live in this community, and they built their version. They have their church in the middle of the town. And the Rajneeshis kind of had the same spirit. It was almost like this extreme libertarian group that believed in we don't need support from others. You build yourself up by your own bootstraps. They embraced capitalism. And so kind of looking at them 40 years later, it was interesting for me to see, wow, there's a lot more similarities here between these two groups, and I think that they like to recognize or realize.
Guys, congratulations on the series. It premieres this Friday, the 16th, on Netflix.
Friday the 16th.
Wild Wild Country. Give them a round of applause, everybody.
Thank you, guys.